Mark, welcome to the program. We're very interested in what you're doing coming from Jefferson City. You're not a stranger to constitutional law. And we actually have a connection between yourself and one of our members, Christine Ellinger, over at Mohila. So it's a small world when we start putting pieces together. But welcome to This Week at Work, Mark.
Thanks, Phil. Glad to be here. Yeah, my wife's been doing HR for 30 years now. It's we've been married for 30 years, and she's been doing it for 30 years. I don't know how she puts up with me most days.
Yeah, well, she can put up with HR. You're probably not that difficult, and that is a tough job. But we're not going to focus on home life here. We want to understand what's going on in Jefferson City. So, Mark, maybe you could just help us start with how did we get to where we are today, with your objection being filed to the Prop A passing and it being unconstitutional. Maybe we'll start from the beginning and walk us through that.
Sure thing, Phil. So all the way back, this all starts back in January of 2023. An initiative petition to change Missouri law was filed with the Secretary of State's office. It's really got two separate subjects, and we'll probably talk about that some as we go on, but it's got the minimum wage increase, which is a very short part of the 10 pages. And then the bulk of the proposed amendment is just this sick leave requirement that's been added. That process kind of goes through the Secretary of State's office and the auditor's office to get what's called a ballot title. And then they have to go circulate and get signatures. They got hundreds of thousands of signatures. They filed those in spring of 2024. There's a deadline that it hits in May of every year, every even-numbered year for the election. Those signatures were verified. The Secretary of State certified that there were enough signatures I think it was in early August. Therefore, it went on the ballot in November, and as we know, it unfortunately passed in November. The way Missouri law works is there's kind of a couple of opportunities to challenge these types of measures. You can do some pre-election challenges, and then there's some post-election challenges. What we've looked at is a post-election challenge that has multiple components to it, but the most important parts are that the voters were misled on the ballot, and then ultimately that the measure itself is unconstitutional. It's unique in Missouri. I can't speak to all states. Some other states I've been involved in, I've never seen quite the process that's done in Missouri. We actually get to file that challenge directly with the Missouri Supreme Court, as opposed to filing it in a local court and having to work its way up to the Supreme Court. So It's a little different nuance than you get in other states.
So you mentioned something that I have heard from many people, of course, trying to help them navigate, okay, what do we do now? And that is, I thought I was voting on minimum wage. I did not know that I was voting on paid sick leave and the extent of the paid sick leave.
Yeah, and that's really, a key component of our case against this measure is people didn't realize that the sick leave measure was so complete and so onerous. Minimum wage is pretty easy. I think most people kind of have an understanding. It's the dollar amount, and then there's an inflation index to it. There's certain people it doesn't apply to. I mean, it's a relatively simple thing. It's a page. This is a 10-page long proposition, and one page is minimum wage. The other 9 pages are the mandatory sick leave. It's got a whole enforcement structure. It exempts certain entities. And most of that was not on the ballot. Nobody had an easy way of knowing what that did. And certainly voters that voted thought it was just minimum wage. They had no idea that they were literally kind of revolutionizing sick leave in the state of Missouri.
Yeah. And I think that is, to me, that's the rub when I'm working with employers. They understand the minimum wage. It's clear and cut. And many employers, not all, but there are a lot of employers that do pay minimum wage. But many of the employers, if they're not affected, they're not concerned by that as much as they are the sick leave. The sick leave then comes with pages of regulation, of compliance that's very complex when it comes to managing that with, payroll systems that may or may not be able to track and manage sick leave the way that it is. And understanding the impact and the cost of that also appears to be something that was maybe misleading, if I can say it that way.
No, no, I think that's actually a really good way of saying it. I think it was misleading. The state auditor in Missouri has to come up with what's called a fiscal note, which is basically the impact upon government of the measure. And it goes out and solicits advice and opinions from various governments. They simply didn't include parts of what those expenses were going to be in their response. Now, government is exempted, ironically, from the sick leave requirement. So
Yeah,
it only applies to private businesses. So first of all, they don't note that it only applies to private businesses. They also don't note that that's going to have a major cost on private businesses. In fact,
a
their
huge
own
cost.
materials, and that's the proponents talk
Sure.
about, could be as much as, hundreds of millions of dollars a year to Missouri employers. And then, if you look at what they put out there, it basically doesn't say that there's any impact to local governments, and local governments said there would be impact. So I really think that fiscal component, how much it's going to cost, what it's going to have, was completely excluded, and voters didn't know about it. And I think that probably changes people's votes if they know the impact.
Yeah, and it didn't seem like businesses had an ability to be engaged in the process and in developing, the language that would then need to be followed. When I read it, I'm like, okay, in my opinion, whoever wrote this, however it came about, missed or purposely left out some very significant language to help make it manageable, if I can say that, with inside an organization.
Yeah, and I think that's the nature of, an outside group. This was mostly funded by outside the state organizations coming in with an idea and not going to, for example, the legislative process where you solicit input from all the
Yeah,
other stakeholders,
exactly.
or even doing just, private roundtables with businesses to get it figured out. They decided to come up with what they wanted on the measure. It comes right out of the East Coast. There's a think tank out there that put all this together, and then they try to just stick it right on top of Missouri, and it doesn't work.
Yeah. It would be nice if on the proposition when we voted, it was clear just to that point, who brought this to the table, right? It wasn't necessarily some citizens in Missouri that were fighting for sick leave necessarily because of whatever their story or situation was. It was outside interest for whatever their reasons are, which also makes it concerning. It sounds to me a little bit like I'll confuse things, but it's topical today. TikTok being owned by the Chinese and infiltrating our country with that, and now having outside interest implicating our Constitution in Missouri versus Missouri citizens and their interest in our lawmakers.
Yeah, I mean, originally the whole concept of doing an initiative petition was the grassroots. People would see a local problem, they couldn't get it fixed in one way or another, and they would, come together as a coalition and get something done. Clearly, Proposition A was not done that way. I mean, this was put together outside the state. The entities, while they have Missouri names, I mean, Missouri Jobs for Justice is the name of the entity, is almost entirely funded by out-of-state interests.
Yeah. Well, who couldn't
They
be
have
in
to
favor of Missouri Jobs for Justice?
they have to gather signatures. It costs millions of dollars. Those millions of dollars didn't come from, average person in Missouri giving 50 cents or a dollar in a kitty. It came from huge 6, 7 figure contributions from outside the state.
Okay. All right, Mark. So now what would we expect, right? So I'm getting phone calls, and when I say that, I'm getting hundreds of phone calls from employers about should we change our pay structures effective January 1? Should we be anticipating and investing in our systems and policy changes to be prepared for May? Is there an expected timeline that you can share with us? Any insight?
Yeah, sure. So when we filed the suit, because the way the law works in Missouri, it comes fairly short notice before the effective date, at least of the minimum wage, which is January 1. We asked the court to expedite. The court will expedite the case. They just will not get us an answer by January 1. That means the minimum wage probably goes into effect on January 1. The real key, and I think what most employers are telling us, is the sick leave component's the real difficult
Mhm.
component. That doesn't go into effect until May 1. And as a result, we're going to move to expedite the case to get an answer well in advance of May 1. because employers need to know either they're going to have to create the systems or they're not going to have to create the systems. And while I guess it's easy enough not to create, there is a lot of timeline in creating the systems. So, I would anticipate that this case gets submitted to the Supreme Court. Probably, my guess is probably early February.
Yeah.
And,
Okay.
with the decision probably coming out either late February or very early March. And there's no appeal from the Missouri Supreme Court. So whatever their answer is will be the final answer. The kind of nice thing about the litigation going directly to the Supreme Court is it's quick and you get a
Yeah.
result. If the
Yeah.
court finds that the entire measure is invalid, then none of it applies. And I realize that doesn't help with the minimum wage because people will have already potentially gotten more pay, but it wouldn't go forward. If they find, they may find that the minimum wage goes forward and the sick leave doesn't go forward in case there's no sick leave. They may find that we have to have a new election,
Yeah.
in which case sometime in the next 2 years, we would have another election on this. Or, the final option is they could find that it's okay and it goes into effect. We're optimistic that the court will see these problems and throw it out, but we won't know what they say until, like I said, probably late February, maybe early March.
So I do get this question, and maybe you have some insight or don't. How is this different than what happened in Illinois just a couple years ago with their paid sick leave? Is it in the way that it was constructed and brought forth by legislation versus proposition and constitutional change? What's the fundamental difference, if any?
Well, I think it's the process is really the fundamental difference. I can't speak to how the Illinois sick leave works. But when you go through the legislative process, you're talking to not just businesses, you're talking to the people who are going to regulate it. What's the best way to write it to do the regulation? What's the impact? What's the timeline to reasonably implement it? Things like that are all through the legislative process. When you go the initiative route with Proposition A in this case, you skip all of that. You just put your plan in, and if voters approve it, then everybody's stuck with it and has to figure out how to operate under it. And that's not a really good recipe to fix it. Now, this is a statute. It's not a constitutional amendment. I think that's real important. The
Okay.
legislature does have the authority to go in and amend this.
Okay.
But that takes its own set of time, and bills, if they're passed, unless they have a specific thing called an emergency clause that makes them go into effect much earlier, they don't go into effect until August 28th, after the session's over. So if it goes through regular legislative session and they have to fix it, the odds are that fix doesn't occur until August 28th of 2025, which is well after everything goes into effect.
Yeah. Everything's sorted by then, for sure.
Yeah.
All right, Mark, anything else that you can think of that might be of interest to our listeners?
No, I would just say, you can watch the Missouri Supreme Court dockets. That case is all very public. You'll see all the pleadings and the briefings. And when the oral arguments occur, they're not just, people are invited to attend the oral arguments in Jeff City, but they also stream them online. So you can listen to them if you choose to do so.
Absolutely. Well, Mark, we appreciate you taking some time and joining us in our program. Thank you very much. I'll be watching and listening with lots of interest as we want to find our way through this with as little impact as possible. Again, thank you very much. It's nice chatting with you today, Mark.
Thanks, Phil. Thanks for having me on, and Merry Christmas. Happy New Year to everyone.
Yep.
Thank you once again for tuning in to This Week at Work. If you enjoy the show, please share it with your colleagues. Forward our invites. Share the link, aimea.org/This Week at Work, or follow or subscribe wherever you get your news and entertainment, like LinkedIn, YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. We're everywhere you are. And you can be part of the show. Send your questions and comments anytime to info@thisweek.work. We'll see you next week, 7:30 a.m. Central Time, when we discuss what's happening this week at work.